Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Some big red ink in the provincial budgets, but no budget expected anytime soon from the new federal government in Ottawa. Welcome to In This Economy. My name is Mike Eppel. This week, Ontario showed the damage that the early days of the trade war have already caused to the province's revenue and spending plans. When the Ford government issued its previous forecast for 2025 back last November, it was talking about a deficit this year of maybe $1.5 billion, possibly even a surplus. But then Trump 2.0 happened. Trade war was started. Premier Doug Ford called an early election, perhaps trying to get ahead of the coming storm of bad news. And the bottom line numbers that Ontario Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy unveiled showed a deficit forecast now at $14.5 billion, shrinking revenue from a struggling manufacturing sector, record-breaking spending at $232 billion, almost $500 billion in overall provincial debt, and some multi-billion-dollar support programs to help businesses weather the drying up of cross-border trade. Now, meantime, in Ottawa, in the first days of the new government there, headed up by Prime Minister Mark Carney, we learned that, yes, there will be a throne speech laying out the government's agenda, including a tax cut for July 1st, and a focus on lowering interprovincial trade barriers. But we have no idea what it's going to cost or how the feds are even doing from a budgetary standpoint because there's no plan for a budget anytime soon. Joining me to talk about some of the monetary maneuvers and economic projections, on the line is Doug Porter, the chief economist at the Bank of Montreal. Doug Porter, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We are coming off an Ontario budget that looks quite a bit different from what the Ford government was talking about from an expectation standpoint for 2025. When the fall fiscal came out last November, they were talking about a $1.5 billion deficit for this year. Oh, how times have changed. It's almost as if we're in the middle of a trade war. And that's certainly indicated with the budgetary deficit projections, the amount of spending that this government is doing. Was there anything that, other than some of the much larger numbers, was there anything that caught your attention to say, whoa, this is quite dramatic?
I would say if you stand back, well, a lot of the focus is on the spending side. I think the real takeaway here is the Ontario government is actually expecting revenues to drop this year, which is unusual. And that's what really drives the much wider deficit. And by the way, to put this in a historical perspective, it's not an especially large deficit as a share of the economy. In fact, when we compare Ontario to the other provinces, Ontario is about the same as the other 9 provinces combined as a share of their economy. If anything, Ontario's deficit is actually slightly smaller than the other 9 provinces. So we really are literally seeing this across the country. Both at the federal and the provincial level, a weakening in the underlying finances. And as much as, governments are talking about how much they're spending to support the economy, and I think, the kind of way they've scaled it is about right. The bigger story is the fact that revenues are actually slated to decline just because of a softer economy.
Well, the day after analysis seemed to be looking back on the, questions why Doug Ford went early to the voters. And this might be the reason why, in as much as this budget was, you want to get the bad news out early in a mandate, and it certainly did that when we're talking about an Ontario economy that is only expected to grow at 0.8% this year. Doug, that's flatline for the most part.
Especially when you look at it, stacked up against kind of population growth we've seen in recent years. I guess the one thing I would also note is I don't think there's much debate about which province is really most vulnerable to the trade war. I do believe Ontario really stands in the front line, especially insofar as the U.S. has picked on autos and steel and to a lesser extent aluminum. Is really facing the pressure. And of course, the auto and steel industries are basically in Ontario. And on top of that, Ontario is about as leveraged to the U.S. economy as any of the other 10 provinces. So Ontario is definitely right in the thick of it. And yeah, that's showing up in a very modest growth outlook for Ontario this year. I guess the other thing I would point out, when we saw the job numbers come out last the other day, Ontario now has the second highest unemployment rate in the country, behind only Newfoundland.
and lost 30,000 plus jobs in the manufacturing sector. Immediate reaction from the Fords and Stellantis and Honda announcing their pause in EV production. When we look at the line items, of course, the biggest spending categories are education and healthcare. Those are up, but again, based on population growth percentage wise, they're not even up that much. So that could lead to cuts. I mean, there's a lot of debate about that, and you can't. It's when we talk about a deficit of 14.5 billion, there was no place to cut particularly. And all these new support programs for small business and companies that are faced with tariff challenges and such. I mean, are those are almost COVID era like, if you will, in as much as they're offering up some money for companies that are struggling.
They are, but what's notable is that program spending is actually slated to rise by less than 2% this year overall. Again, while there's a lot of focus on spending, the bottom line does not show that large of a spending increase. Now, I will say, oftentimes what we found in Ontario budgets is they often underestimate both spending and revenues. It's very normal to see in-year or end-of-year revisions upward for both. And I would not at all be surprised if we come back in a year from now and find that both revenues and spending actually turn out to be higher than what's in this budget. We may well end up with, a deficit of roughly the same neighborhood, but it's not at all rare to have Ontario misfire in terms of their projections for budget deficits, both to good and bad. We've seen some really big revisions. So this is a plan, but let's face it, there's a lot of uncertainties, not just on the trade front, but especially on the trade front, that can easily knock this plan offline in the next year.
Well, there were some choices being made by this government too on the revenue side. When you look at what they've pushed through for the LCBO, beer and wine and convenience stores, the hit that actually led to for revenue, some of the changes there, making the gas tax cut permanent. They'd already eliminated things, for licensing fees and things like that. So I mean, they are the master of their own revenue generation, aren't they? And as much as they're trying to give things back to taxpayers, the people, but at the same time, that's hitting the bottom line.
It definitely is, but the reality is Ontario's revenues are largely driven, first and foremost by personal income taxes, corporate income taxes, and sales taxes. Those are really the big three, and a lot of those other items, they make the headlines, they make for good stories, but that's not what really drives revenues. Ultimately, it will be how the economy does, and I will say, I think that this budget is based on a fairly realistic, and if anything, I would say a cautious outlook for the economy. There is the chance that the economy actually could do a bit better than what the budget is based on. We're definitely not through the trade war by any means, but there is the chance that it's not going to be as bad as what some of the economic forecasts had built in.
They pushed the likelihood of a budgetary surplus back another 2 years. And that's kind of like the 5-day weather forecast. On the 5th day, it's going to be great. It never necessarily transpired. And even then they've got, well, it could be a surplus of 7.5%, but it might also be a surplus or a deficit of $7.5 billion. I mean, it's just it's guesswork, even just 2 years out, isn't it?
It completely is. I mean, I think it's worthwhile having a medium-term plan, but in terms of the deficit forecast, I just would not, and I never have. I don't take it that seriously. I think it's aspirational. It tells you what the government is aiming for, but I wouldn't, as an economist, I wouldn't take it that seriously. I think we all know, how many uncertainties lie ahead, how many different ways the global economy can take us. And especially on the trade war. So I just don't really look much beyond this year's forecast for the deficit.
Let's change our focus a little bit to what was going on in Ottawa this week with the new Carney government saying ostensibly they're not going to have a budget anytime soon. And that raised a lot of a lot of eyebrows in as much as, okay, well, really, you can't give us a fiscal update to any degree of where the federal government is from a monetary standpoint. That was kind of an interesting start to a new mandate, I thought.
I will flatly tell you I am surprised, especially since the finance minister is the same one who was in the cabinet before the election. It is surprising.
He's kind of new to the job, I get that, but he's had some time to look over the books. I would assume that they could put out even something. They're talking about a big tax cut by July 1st and a whole bunch of other things. I'm just simply shocked that they can't put out some sort of a fiscal statement between now and then.
I agree. I mean, I think they could have put out an interim, uh, very brief fiscal update at some point over the next month, and then maybe aim for something like a mini budget later this year. I tend to agree. Like if we're waiting for the fall economic statement, that could be 6 months or more from now. I actually do think it would be appropriate to deliver at least an update in terms of where the budget outlook might be right now. Basically what we're working off of is the economic statement from last December, which really predated the trade war, and perhaps the Liberals' own election platform. Based on that, I'd be assuming this year's budget deficit is in the neighborhood of about $60 billion. That's what was in the election platform. But that was arguably based on a relatively optimistic economic scenario. So it's quite possible that we're looking at a little bit of a bigger budget deficit than that for this year.
I wonder if current Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem is calling former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney and saying, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" Because wouldn't the Bank of Canada like to also know what the government's spending? And I mean, they'll get some of it, of course, from the speech from the throne. But at the same time, if you're trying to set monetary policy, knowing what the feds are doing, that might help a little bit.
You make a very good point. The Bank of Canada is often on record saying that they don't try to forecast fiscal policy. They use what's officially in the plan when they try to set monetary policy. They do need a good guide on that front. I would actually assert that of everyone, it's actually the Bank of Canada who really needs a budgetary statement more than anyone. To be clear, Ottawa can still enact, tax and spending changes. We saw them, for instance, sign off on a 1 point cut in the lowest marginal rate this week. So it's not as if their hands are tied, but for others, it's helpful to know where the official word is on where finances stand and where we might be going, and probably as much for the Bank of Canada as anyone.
Is there a risk that any of these budgets that have been, or provincial budgets that have been released, and the lack of a budget from the feds, are the credit rating agencies looking at any of this?
They definitely are. They've already taken a long look at both BC and Quebec, for instance. I don't think there's too much concern over Canada's Ottawa situation. But yeah, and I mean, make a good point. That's essentially the ratings agencies base their views off of the official budgets and economic statements, and they don't have much to work on right now at the federal level.
Before we let you go, Doug, got to ask you, we're a couple of weeks away from the Bank of Canada's next announcement. What do you think? Did they go 25?
Well, we've got two very big numbers before that the bank will have before they have to make that decision. Of course, we get the inflation reading of our own for April, which we think will be very benign because gasoline prices came down a lot in April. Of course, that doesn't do much for core inflation, but we do think headline inflation could drop as low as 1.5%. And then we get the full accounting for growth in the first quarter right at the end of this month, just before the bank has to decide. Importantly, we'll also get an early reading for April, which is a key month. That was the first real month of the trade war for all of us, and I think that number is going to be very important for the bank. At this point, we are leaning slightly in the direction of the bank cutting rates by a quarter in June, but we're not locked into that. Just like the bank, we're waiting to see, what happens in these two very key economic reports.
It's been kind of interesting, the most recent inflation data, case in point this past week out of the States, and you're saying April out of Canada is going to be down or lower than it was. The tariff impact really hasn't started to show up in the CPI data, has it yet?
Not really at all. And it's interesting because if you look at the surveys, both in the U.S. and Canada, consumers are braced for this big run up in inflation. And, we definitely didn't see it in the US in April at all, really. And I'm, the one thing about Canada is we've only put tariffs on a few items from the US and really nothing else. And, the Canadian dollar has, if anything, strengthened in recent weeks, and we've got this big decline in gasoline prices. So, I don't think we're going to get that much sting in the tail for inflation in Canada from the trade war.
So it opens the door for the Bank of Canada to cut interest rates if they want to, and then worry about things later. But I know that's not how they work, but I'm sure there are a lot of borrowers out there who are saying, please, another cut would be fine. Thank you, Doug. Thanks for joining us.
Anytime.
And that was the In This Economy podcast, joined by Doug Porter, the chief economist at the Bank of Montreal. You can send your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Or you can leave us a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can also find us on the Seeker app or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Please rate, review, follow, and share. My name is Mike Eppel. Thanks for listening.